but there's always the WOVA way to reach out and ask questions. I believe our next presentation is University Partnerships for Innovative Climate Change Solutions. Two members of the team at New York State Department of State, Office of Planning, Development and Community Infrastructure, Lizzy Mogus Garcia, Ocean and Lakes Policy Analyst, and Marion Powell, Coastal Resource Specialist. Please take it away. Barbara, do you still have the? I'll go find it. Okay.
Can you use the arrow keys?
I think people should have those.
Yeah.
Hello, hello.
Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Lizzy Mogus Garcia, pronoun she, they, and I work at the Office of Planning. Thank you. Development Community Infrastructure, which is housed within the Department of State, located at the Albany office.
And my name is Marion Powell. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm a coastal resource specialist for the local waterfront revitalization program, also at OPDCI.
So we're going to talk a little bit about our University Partnerships for Innovative Climate Solutions initiative that we call UPICS, a little bit about the initiative, and then do some project highlights.
I can't see this. Happening all day with Zoom. A lot of fun. I'm sorry. I don't know if I actually have a workaround for it.
People are using presentation notes.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
That's okay. Okay. That was okay. All right, so we'll get into it. I'll let Marion do the team.
Yeah, so we're going to just do a quick meet the team. So it is not just Lizzy and I who is behind the team at UPICS, but we also have Keisha Santiago, who is our OPDCI Deputy Secretary of State. And then, of course, we also have Nicole Jean Christian, who is our DOS Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Director. And then we also have Jamie Burchard, who is in the audience today, who is our OPDCI Resilience and Community Infrastructure Director. And then also special shout out to Isabella Betancourt, who is our OPDCI Oceans and Great Lakes Policy Analyst, and she has also worked with us extensively on this project. So I'm also going to give a quick overview of UPICS. So apologies, I'm going to be looking back and forth because there is a lot of information here. But so essentially the New York State Department of State, OPDCI, identified strategic relocation as a priority topic for this 2024-2025 school year. The proposed presentation summarizes the partnership and includes discussion from student projects throughout the state. OPDCI's University Partnerships for Innovative Climate Change Solutions. These include undergrads and graduate classes, and that are mainly led by the professors, and Lizzy and I work extensively with these professors and to be able to address state policies with also merging the different actionable strategies that puts in together the university's research, having students' creative ideologies included, and then also state policies and our current different programs that we have at the state, such as the Local Waterfront Revitalization Program that I mentioned, BOA, which stands for Brownfield Opportunity Areas, and then a bunch of other different types of programs that we have within our office that students can learn more about while also learning more about state policies and then integrating their creative ideas. And then this is also, sorry, these are also just some of the different things that we touch upon, such as best practices for communications and making policy recommendations, developing financial analysis and formulas for mitigation activities, and visualizations, including resiliency and economic scenario data analyses and mapping. So there's definitely a diversity of topics that are covered within UPICS.
And so we just wanted to highlight the partnerships through the year. So this really started out with the fall 2022 with the University at Albany, and then really has expanded since then. And so we've worked with mostly New York State-based schools, but both public and private through the SUNY system and outside of it, as well as also Harvard University. So we weren't fully only in the New York State space, which is very exciting. So here you'll see the different semesters and years that we've worked throughout and the different schools and programs that we've been engaging in throughout. And I'll just note the main driver and main themes that really we come across and have been focusing on are climate adaptation and specifically strategic relocation, as that's been a really big focus for our team at OPDCI. And so really seeing how different like visualizations and policy recommendations and overall outcomes from the students and the professors can then be directly plugging into what the state is developing out, really essentially expanding that brain power and creativity and bringing that into the state side. And then, like I said, we wanted to focus more on like project highlights, so that's the exciting part of UPIC. Really wanted to amplify some of the students' works throughout the years. And so we're gonna highlight some from fall 2023, and then we'll highlight this past academic year that we just finished up. So for fall 2023, we partnered with SUNY ESF, so College of Environmental Science and Forestry. They're up in Syracuse. We partnered with their Masters of Landscape Architecture studio, in which students focused on developing designs for post-relocation community typographies in 5 different regions of New York State. So those are the regions that we had. There were teams for each one of them. So we had Lake Ontario, Hudson Valley, Far Rockaway, Long Island, North Shore, and Long Island South Shore, understanding that the North Shore and South Shore are very different. And so we wanted to make sure that both those typologies were embedded within. Within the typologies too, the students looked at rural versus urban, dense versus not dense, and a variety of other areas to really classify kind of what typologies and visualizations could we be imagining for those areas. So the ones that are on the screen right now are from Hudson Valley. I'll also note too, something that was unique to this project is that we were actually able to go out on field trips with the students. And so each student team went out to each region and were able to really see different areas and put those typologies together. So essentially the visualizations are a combination of different locations, because one of the main things that we were trying to get at is that if we have visualizations of like post-relocation land use options when it comes to like strategic relocation and we're going communities, we wanted to kind of take that pulling back approach and not necessarily be like, oh, that's my house, that's my family's house, what the heck? There's now like a park there, what happened, right? And so we wanted to make sure that they're representative of the typology, but not specific to them for kind of like that first round. So this is the Hudson Valley crew. So they analyzed a series. Oh, sorry. I'm like really happy with this button. Sorry. The Hudson Valley crew analyzed a series of factors, including biodiversity and ecosystems, different shoreline types, land cover, sea level rise projections, as well as taking a look at environmental justice components within these different communities, and created an innovative approach that included shoreline stabilization to reduce erosion, created systems that accommodate for flooding, applied heat and wind reduction techniques, and really just took unique features of each part in there. And then the next one was the Lake Ontario team that I wanted to highlight. So they analyze a series of factors that are more specific to the Great Lakes versus if we're looking at, the bays or the ocean. And so they looked at erosion, flooding, storming events, and in response, they created an innovative approach that included dune restoration, shoreline softening, and multi-use boardwalks. They really wanted to focus in on accessible features as well to kind of push beyond just like the ADA requirements and seeing how we can make these different public spaces more accessible to all. So they took both ecological and social elements into account, and found ways to not only improve the shoreline conditions, but also create spaces that could be used widely by the public. One thing to note, so the bigger picture there was one that really stuck out to us. One of the main comments that we went back and forth with the students was also something along the lines of like commemoration of land lost behind, of homes, right? There's such a connection there. And so how can we get creative with not only making a public space that's resilient, but also having that commemoration piece. So they really dug deep into critical points of the community and what's native to the area and creating like beautiful gardens that would have then memorials of, houses that were there previously. And then I'll just go quickly over this one. So the last time we came and presented at this conference, we had the Bard College team. They were working on their MBA in sustainability. So that's what the top picture is. They were here last time and talked about the engagement toolbox and a cost benefit analysis that they've developed out. Following that year, one of the students wanted to continue building out the cost benefit analysis and go through essentially what the costs and benefits, right, are either of doing nothing and staying, fortifying, elevating, and then ultimately relocating, and really digging into more of like the social costs and benefits of things too, which is really hard sometimes to represent. So that was a really neat project that then was able to continue on through a capstone. I'll pass it to you.
And so for this year, we also worked with SUNY, like ESF that Lizzy was talking about. And this was both graduate students and undergraduate students. And we worked specifically with the class that's the landscape architecture school, through their design studio 2. And the score specifically addressed climate migration at coastal sites by designing solutions for communities that are facing displacement due to climate change impacts, focusing on strategic relocation and adaptation. So everything that we're definitely looking for and interested in. So in the spring, we got to continue our partnership with SUNY ESF, also through their Water, Climate, and Society course, which kind of discussed more of the society and political recommendations for their class. So we had a bit of duality with having the design studio, being able to create maps. So like Lizzy said, there was a focus on the south shore of Long Island. And as you can see through very tiny little letters with the legends, but it definitely shows the high-risk zones in the red, and then also the different types of communities that they identified throughout, which included Bayshore, Mastic Beach, and Riverhead. So these were the 3 communities that they identified as high risk. And since SUNY ESF is located in Syracuse, they're thinking from the perspective of not only just locals that live there. A lot of the students there were from Syracuse that we talked to, so they brought in that perspective, but also as a receiving community. So we definitely, I feel like, had a lot of discussions where folks were like, well, are people in Syracuse ready to receive this many climate migrants to come in? What are we going to do to be able to prepare? So luckily, with the students' creativity, we're able to sort of think of ideas like the pedestrianization of different roads in Syracuse, pocket communities. Also, since we're the planning and development office, we're also thought about developing brownfield areas and how that would look like in Syracuse, and also smart growth principles of being able to sort of diversifying different types of housing units and being able to have multi-purpose housing. So it's definitely a lot of these things came into conversation when it came to with SUNY ESF. And then we also had University of Buffalo as one of our university partnerships, and this was also another graduate and undergraduate class. So it was definitely interesting to kind of see how these 2 classes melded together by sort of complementing each other, with the graduate students kind of focusing on more specific project-oriented things, whereas the undergrads, they had a professor who was currently working at the local city planning. So they were able to look at the vulnerability assessments at Buffalo to sort of get an idea of where exactly are the areas that need new infrastructure, what are the areas that they could potentially do community resilience hubs, which is one of the solutions that the students brought forward. And just overall, having also policy recommendations of the students kept bringing up the idea of not wanting to be the second priority when it came to climate migrants coming in, and just not, since Buffalo is already having a housing crisis, so or a lack of housing available. So students definitely brought that up as part of the policy recommendations. And there's definitely also, I would say too, with the graduate students, they really brought forth with the brownfield opportunity areas with our office and being able to transform different areas in Buffalo into more revitalizing areas. So such as like the bottom right, that is an image that was made from graduate students at the University of Buffalo using one of our brownfield opportunity areas and sort of creating it as a more sustainable and green infrastructure friendly environment at Buffalo. So we definitely got a lot of creative ideas through this partnership as well.
And that wraps it up. We wanted to keep it nice and quick for you all. But feel free to reach out and connect if you have any more questions or want to talk through any more of the projects. That was just like a little tidbit of the many very neat projects that the students are then able to not only say that they're plugging into state policy and programs, but also something that's tangible that they can take with them in their portfolios as they continue on. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Next, we have Brian Kraus. He's a candidate for a master's degree in energy and environmental policy at the University of Delaware. His presentation is an assessment of planning for resilience in Sussex.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. And my name is Ryan Kraus. I'll be talking about planning for resilience in Sussex County in Delaware. So a little bit of background about Sussex. It's the southernmost county in the state of Delaware, and it's growing really fast. It's growing quite a bit over the last 15, 20 years, especially. So there's quite a bit of development going on in that region, especially the eastern part of the county, which is also where the inland bays are. The inland bays are heavily exposed to both flooding risk and sea level rise, with quite a bit of SLR, especially over the next 100 years, like 5 feet, give or take, by the end of the century in a lot of those areas. And many of these populated areas are beach towns, first of all. And many of those are battery died. We'll use this one. And many of those beach towns are designated as growth areas. Hot potato with the mics. So many of those populated hazard areas are also designated as growth areas under the Delaware's policy or strategies, excuse me, for state policies and spending, more commonly called the state strategies. So let's talk a little bit about those state strategies because they form a really important component of the state's growth management system. The two big elements of the growth management system are its statewide comprehensive planning mandate and this set of strategies, which are expected to be incorporated into local comprehensive plans and also guide state spending across the state. The way it works is that the whole state is divided up into levels 1 through 4, where levels 1 and 2 are growth areas. State wants growth there, will invest and contribute state resources to infrastructure, especially in those areas. Level 3 is kind of it's permitted. The state doesn't necessarily push too hard to have growth there, but also doesn't try to avoid it. But the idea is that it's attempting to mitigate sprawl by avoiding growth and keeping growth out of level 4. Those are mostly agricultural and forested areas, which are kind of inland in the county. All of those gray spaces are out of play. Those are legally protected for one reason or another. A lot of state or federal preserves, areas protected by easement or some other kind of regulation. So they are quite literally legally out of play for future development. So that brings us a little bit to our objectives. What are we trying to look into here? So first question is, where do inland bay communities plan for resilience? And second, how is Delaware's growth management system contributing to or potentially undermining flood resilience within this inland bay area? So let's look at that area just a little bit. The inland bays are a set of 3 tidal bays in eastern Sussex County and southern Delaware. Those are the Rehoboth Bay, Indian River Bay, and Little Assawoman Bay, down all the way at the bottom. So our study area includes 12 municipalities within this area, which is roughly informed by the Inland Bay watershed. So we're looking at 12 municipalities within this area, as well as unincorporated Sussex County, which in this case, we look at 45 census tracts. And the main method that we're using here is the Plan Integration for Resilience Scorecard, which, if you're familiar with plan content analysis, is basically a spatial variant of a really classic plan content analysis approach that's intended to not only look at what policies are present in the plans, but incorporating multiple plans, so all the plans that have anything to do with land use or resilience in this study area, and how those different policies interact, and most importantly, where they're taking effect. So just to summarize this method really quickly, first thing we do is inventory every single policy that we can identify in all of the applicable plans, which in this case is 22 plans from this whole population. We screen them just to make sure that they're applicable and most importantly mappable so that we can tie them to the hazard area. We then assign them to planning districts, so exactly where is that policy taking effect. We intersect those planning districts, which are informed by the plan content, the plan language, or in this case of the unincorporated part of the county census tracts. And then we intersect those planning districts with the hazard area, which in this case is the FEMA 100-year floodplain. We then code all of those policies, 1 if it contributes to resilience in the area, -1 if it detracts from resilience in that area, or 0 if it has no or an unclear effect. All right, so let's get into the numbers a little bit. So a first thing that we look into is how do these policies score by the type of plan that they come from? So the first thing that really jumps out here is that hazard mitigation and climate-specific, resilience-specific plans have a huge role to play in planning for resilience, as we might expect. So those plans overwhelmingly contain policies that contribute to resilience against flooding. Comprehensive plans tend to be quite mixed and vary a lot more based on where you are, the specific community, which we'll come back to in just a second, more detail. And we also include downtown development plans, sub-area plans, transportation plans especially. And those downtown and transportation plans have a pretty strong tendency to include policies that detract from resilience, mainly by promoting higher density development within the hazard area. So we look at a few correlations between a handful of attributes, key attributes that we looked at. This is really just a summary of what we looked at, but some key correlations between the policy scores, higher policy scores in this case, and these other details. So the one thing that really jumps off the page is physical vulnerability. So physical vulnerability takes 2 different forms. We look at population within that area, but also property values within that area. So the total amount of property measured in dollars, and also as a percentage of the total properties within that district that fall within the hazard area. So how much of a district's property falls within a flood zone? The more physically exposed it is, or the more property is exposed, the higher a policy response we see in those plans. This incidentally is true both whether you look at it as just a raw dollar figure or kind of treat it as a percentage of that district's total property. So this effect is true whether it's a wealthy municipality with a high tax base or a less wealthy municipality, or census tract as well. It's true for both unincorporated Sussex as well as other municipalities. We also see it's true for population. The one thing that also sticks out is the presence of those growth areas, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the next couple slides, but the presence of those growth areas that you noticed earlier from the state strategies does not seem to affect whether that area has more or less resilience planning going on. We do see a kind of interesting effect too with measures of social vulnerability. So SVI, just CDC, Social Vulnerability Index, as well as Environmental Justice Index. We see a little bit of an effect only in the county districts, so nothing in the municipalities, but county districts that have a higher EJI especially, so are considered more socially vulnerable in terms of EJI, also tend to have higher policy scores. Which let's look at that a little bit over here. So a lot of those, this is actually property vulnerability and the resilience policy scores. But that EJI is especially true in some of those areas around that middle bay, the Indian River Bay, which there's some nuance there, but it's mostly tied to a large retiree population in this area. But this is a visualization of the property vulnerability and the resilience policy score relationship. So from here on out, it's all the fun stuff. These are all maps. It's great. And you can see all those dark blue, purplish areas are places where there's both high property vulnerability and a high policy response. So you can see most of that area, this is true, the grayed out areas are low, low, the dark purples are high, highs. Most of the areas that we look at fall into one of those two categories. A couple of interesting exceptions are way up in the northern section of our study area, the north edge of Rehoboth Bay up at the top. You see a little bit of that pink around there where there's a high exposure and a relatively low policy score. And there are a few more tracts towards the bottom and the center. And those are mostly, a lot of that effect, right? The reason those are exceptions actually has a lot to do with the state-run transportation plans. So despite the relatively high physical vulnerability in those areas, there's a lot of activity funded by the state to expand roadway networks and build out transportation infrastructure in those areas. So this is showing side by side, or showing the overlap between the 100-year floodplain and the growth areas. So that green that we see a little bit inland, those are all growth areas, levels 1 and 2, where the state wants to promote growth. The purple on the right side is the floodplain. And those yellow patches, it's a little hard to see, they're a little small in this map, but those yellow patches are the intersection between those. So the places where the floodplain and the growth areas overlap or intersect are those yellow patches. And you can see at the county scale, there's actually not a lot of overlap. So what this suggests is that for the most part, especially in unincorporated Sussex County, the growth areas are for the most part staying outside of the floodplain. Really not a lot of intersection, which is from a resilience perspective, what we generally want to see. There are a lot of exceptions, and those are mostly, as you can see, kind of in that southeastern pocket of the county, which this is another way of looking at that same thing. So anything that's highlighted on this map are those same intersections. In this case, we also include in that lighter yellow some of the areas that are in level 3, so not really, neither growth areas nor areas to be avoided, that kind of middle ground. And we see quite a few overlaps here that really pop up, especially in that southeastern area of the county, which I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. Those are mostly the communities of Ocean View, Bethany Beach, South Bethany, and to an extent, Fenwick Island. I highlight those. The ones on the left have a lot more land area overlap than they do population overlap. The ones on the coast are those beach towns, which are, in addition to having this overlap between the growth area and the floodplain, also are pretty thoroughly built out. Fairly dense. There's a lot of physical exposure to the hazard in there. And this is another way of looking at a similar number. So this one here is showing the share of that hazard area that falls within the growth area. And you can see, especially in some of those eastern towns, Ocean View, Bethany Beach, South Bethany, and in that really deep red section, those are areas where almost, or in some cases, exactly 100% of that community's floodplain is also designated as a growth area, where the state is trying to push density and further growth in that area. So just to wrap things up with a handful of conclusions and major takeaways. So what does this show us? Communities are planning for, by and large, planning for resilience in the most exposed areas. This is a really clear pattern across both unincorporated Sussex and the municipalities, and is an interesting finding in this case because it actually conflicts or contrasts with some previous case studies using the similar methodology in other communities. There have been a handful. The method's been around for about 10 years. There aren't a ton of case studies, but from some of them, have either found the complete opposite, so the less vulnerable areas or less physically exposed areas are more active in implementing or in planning for resilience, or mixed results. So this is the first that I'm aware of that finds in this direction, the relationship in this direction. It also highlights the impact and importance of those more narrow scope, climate-focused, resilient-focused plans in producing policies that contribute to resilience, and a handful of those findings around the state strategy specifically. So while overall countywide, there aren't too many red flags, those exceptions, those towns, the beach towns in the southeast are a really significant cause of concern, and a little bit of an example of these two conflicting policy objectives where the state is attempting to limit sprawl, which has a number of climate upsides, of course, especially in mitigation, but is in the course of doing that, prioritizing development in densely populated areas or already developed areas, and unfortunately does not seem to be in those towns' cases, taking into account the fact that that's also a hazard area. So it still leaves us opportunities to do a little bit of a better job going forward in those communities of meshing adaptation and mitigation. So thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. At this rate, we are going to have time for questions at the end, I'm happy to say. And I'm going to invite Sonya Sternlieb, who is a resilience planner at Stantec, to come up. And when her presentation is loaded, she will talk to us about fluid conversations, assessing two policy tools for managed retreat. We'll just give you a chance to start when the presentation is ready.
Here from here. Let me grab my computer. This word.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonya Sternlieb. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my graduate school research, looking at two tools that could potentially have use in retreat. So I'm going to talk briefly about my research questions and methods, get into my framework development, then take a look at those two tools, and then talk about a few recommendations that emerged from my research. So managed retreat that's equitable involves planning for housing access and affordability, ensuring affected residents can move to equally less flood-prone areas, preventing climate gentrification and displacement within less hazard-prone communities, and ensuring that redevelopment doesn't occur after existing structures are addressed. So an equitable approach to resilience, as I'd like to think about it, takes a bounce-forward approach. So seeking to create a more just world through retreat. So that can look like addressing wealth and property access gaps and different risk exposure. So in that context, my first question asks what equitable and reparative planning should look like in a managed retreat context. I'm also interested in understanding how social values play a role in retreat possibilities. So my second question seeks to look at American cultural understandings of like relationships to society, nature, and technology, and see how those shape what people think is possible. And then finally, I'm going to apply some of that to look at these two tools. So a couple quotes that I found pretty useful for developing a framework or thinking about how retreat engages with politics, with ideas of anti-capitalism, and with human exemptionalism frameworks. So as I was doing the literature review that constituted most of this work, I found that there was a divide between folks writing about this who felt like adaptation is sort of this apolitical process where barriers to planning are, about information access, about capacity, about failures in cooperation, generally challenges that can be overcome without substantially shifting existing economic systems. But other researchers that I encountered talked a bit more about how climate policy and adaptation failed because they are deep politicized. So thinking about the radical potential of these sort of processes is something that seemed really interesting to me. And the last sort of framing component that stood out to me is the idea of human exceptionalism, which holds that, all or most of our problems, including environmental or urban ones, can be solved through human ingenuity and technology. And in that context, recognizing that there might be a need to abandon some portion of human settlements means recognizing that humans, like other creatures, are somewhat controlled by their environments, are not the masters of everything, and have total control over their fate. I think that's a context that might contribute to limited engagement with retreat as an option. So a couple questions and answers that came up through my work were thinking a bit about why cities, towns, and regional governments should play a role in leading these efforts. I think recent political events kind of highlight the value of that, but there are strengths here as well in elevating community level agency and decision making. Thinking about why efforts to stay can enhance inequities and the way that those costs of adaptation can drive displacement or fail to meet the full scope of need. And a key part of equity in this context is recognizing the role that legacies of planning have played in creating inequitable risk. That feels really important for both understanding where risk is and getting communities on board with reparative planning structures. And again, as a whole, I think retreat requires engaging with this idea we have that humans have this mastery over nature, and accepting that that may not be the case. I was also really curious about what social aspects of communities might make retreat more or less likely. So really interested to see research that talked about the role that individual versus collectivist values plays. So in communities that really value self-sufficiency, maybe have a greater sense of entitlement, are really attached to their property rights, and don't have faith in their neighbors' capacity to act for the greater good, there seems like less interest in engaging in collective forms of retreat that really require that kind of trust. On the flip side, the research that I looked through found that communities with collectivist values might be better prepared for this work. Those who are already facing other forms of vulnerability or marginalization might find the transformative promise more appealing. Lastly, I know that the language used to discuss retreat is something that's kind of still being contested, even in the changing name of this conference. You can see it. And one aspect of that challenge that stuck out to me is the way that retreat uses this militaristic language. You're giving up, you're kind of like being subsumed by natural forces. And that maybe sort of activates people's ideas about needing to resist that. But focusing on new futures and transformation can sort of restore agency and capacity. So with that framework in mind, I'm going to get to the two tools that I looked at. And the first one is rolling easements. So pretty similar to a regular easement, but the concept here is that the easement's boundaries move, for instance, in this case, with a rising tide or a shifting floodplain or the other kind of adaptation trigger it's tied to. So these are legally enforceable agreements that allow like these rights to migrate, that can be useful also in helping with the movement of infrastructure. So you might have an easement for a roadway or a utility corridor, and it might be between the ocean and someone's private property, and that's ensuring that that infrastructure has the capacity to move can be important there. And while this may be less dramatic than a buyout, we still have development in the floodplain happening today. We still have infrastructure there, and so having additional tools, maybe more gradual ones to help with this, seems it could be valuable. There are some issues here that came up in the literature I read. So failure to protect public access to these waterfronts, maybe mostly benefiting wealthier landholders, even when there are, lower income, but like land wealthy folks, the tax benefits may be less applicable there. I saw some interesting work around folks using conservation easements and elevating the tax benefits they get by performing the possibility of development. And you can see where the capacity or interest in doing that might not be evenly dispersed among landholders of all backgrounds. So ideas that kind of came up for tackling some of these included requiring these easements to have public access, getting overlay districts in place to limit people's capacity to perform development potential. And then one issue that I think comes up here and in some other tools is the fact that biased appraisal processes have historically undervalued land held by people of color. So if we're going to have these somewhat market-based mechanisms, ensuring that there's a fair appraisal process is a really important part. The other tool that I wanted to talk about are transfer of development rights programs. So these enable landholders who own property in a designated sending area, perhaps as in this case in the floodplain, to sell the right to development associated with their property to owners of land in a designated receiving area. So a conservation easement is established on the sending parcel, and then whoever holds that development right can use it to develop a receiving parcel to a greater extent. So this ideally could be used in a context where you're trying to do some infill development. Your developer is able to buy these rights from you and then they build a higher structure. So in this capacity, maybe we're talking about some of the limitations with buyout funding that we may encounter more in the future. So in this capacity, the person who owns this land, maybe they're not able to recoup the whole value, but they're able to sell the property rights associated with it to still be made partially financially whole while supporting greater densification. And a thing that's a little wild about this is that the city that's doing this kind of program really sets the value of these development rights almost sort of arbitrarily. So there's a lot of finagling with the policy that you need to do here to make sure it's a reasonable structure. But the perk of this is that instead of depending on a federal source for funding buyouts, they're sort of partially funded by developers. It's more of a market-based approach, so definitely has pitfalls there, but potentially a useful tool. So the pitfalls that I would anticipate encountering are that this has been used for historical building preservation, for farmland preservation. It hasn't really been used as much in a flooding context. It hasn't been, I haven't seen good research about ensuring that this happens in ways that ensure landholders of color are treated equally and get equal worth for their land. It is dependent on growth happening in a relatively nearby context. And there's a lot of governing capacity that's needed to establish these receiving areas to figure out what value to assign to these structures. But and then there's this risk of contributing to inequitability. And if we want to decommodify land and housing, this doesn't really further those goals. But things that can make this more beneficial are having public TDR banks to assure that anyone looking to participate in this has equal access to the market, that their land will be valued equivalently. One could consider elevating the value of development rights purchased from formerly redlined areas to support a sort of reparative approach. And seeing this program successfully implemented can increase belief in one community's governing capacity to act on this. And there are ways to incorporate support for affordable housing too. And then a couple gaps that came up as I was doing this work, some of which have been talked about by others. The need for like metrics for this kind of program. And it would be great to have chances to capture the experiences of people who have been engaged in any kind of these programs and have seen how it's worked for them. Going back to some of those ideas about the language and framework, I think there's opportunities to use science to build kind of like restore some of the agency that's lost and get shared understanding of risks. And these are sort of, I think, legally complicated and like complicated from a planning perspective techniques. So making resources available for local governments and planners make it easier to implement them. And then a couple other technical resources that seem like they'd be useful that have been well discussed throughout. So I will stop there.
So finally, my Resilient Coastal Communities Project colleagues, Resilient Coastal Communities is a collaboration between the Columbia Climate School and the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We have Bernadette Baird-Zars, Assistant Professor at the Blouskine School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. Victoria Sanders, Climate and Health Program Manager at New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Halas Lee, Sustainability Planner at TY Lin. And Amelia Ding is a student, research associate, and rising fourth-year student at Barnard College. They are presenting RCCP's research on creating fair and accountable spaces in the face of flood risks, how to support community-led resilience planning.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you all of you for making it to the end. Congratulations. I know it's been a lot. A lot of us have been here since Monday morning, so thank you so much for sticking it out. I'm going to be setting the stage for our conversation and where we're coming from. Like Paul said, I am Victoria Sanders. I work at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and I am the Climate and Health Programs Manager. So we should be okay. Okay, so so we in our work have been wanting to better understand essentially how to do better community engagement. We saw a gap in the information that we were able to find in relation to community engagement. We really wanted to understand, what communities want to see from community engagement. All of the information we were seeing was coming from other sources. If there was any at all on how to do good community engagement. So that kind of underpins the research we do. And this is the second iteration of that research. So with this phase of research, we talked to communities here in New York City and New Jersey, and also all around the country in places like Florida and California and Louisiana to find stories of where and how flood adaptation processes and outcomes were seen as successful, again, by the communities themselves. These communities all had shared experiences and challenges that included ever-growing climate and environmental dangers, lack of funding and investment, opaque top-down planning processes that didn't represent their needs, concerns, and lived experiences, and also just amazing communities filled with wonderful, capable people who wanted to help their neighbors, families, and themselves live happier, healthier lives long-term. One example of that is El Puente, which is an organization that is actually one of NEJA's members. And they support environmental justice communities within Williamsburg and Bushwick. That's in Brooklyn, for those of you who may not be locals. And they fit this mold of incredible people who face a lot of injustices and challenges. Historically, they haven't received the respect that their decades of work and community leadership deserves, with government and academic processes generally failing to support self-determination and uplifting the priorities and projects that they have identified and created. They had hundreds of communities like them they and hundreds of communities like them, sorry, have struggled to protect themselves. But there are some examples where community engagement and planning processes have broken the mold and yielded different, better results. For El Puente, an example of a better process is the BQ Green. This is an example or an image of the visioning of that project, which is not completed yet, but it's considered so far a successful process by the community because it was actually community vision, something that they thought of, that they wanted, and the government came in to kind of work with them and help support their vision for their community and a problem that they saw that they wanted to solve. So while this process is ongoing, it's really important, and yeah, we're hoping to see that improve moving forward. But like I said, this isn't the story most of the time. So we did this research to figure out the ingredients and components that helped them. And we wanted to identify actionable elements to create just processes that can lead to better outcomes and better stories in the future. And that is where the Resilient Coastal Communities Project comes in. And this is a project that is co-led by NEJA, my organization, and Columbia's Center for Sustainable Urban Development. And I will hand it over to Bernadette to keep us going.
Yeah, I'm a member of the Resilient Coastal Communities Project. I'm now at Rutgers. It's co-led by Paul Gallet sitting here. But I want to say it's kind of a unique, interesting collaboration that's been ongoing and blends advocacy, like there's us complaining to the Army Corps in their conference room, with co-produced research that has pretty strong honoraria backing it up. With in our first round, our papers in Giro Forum that came out last year, highlighted community-based organizations and leaders from the New York and New Jersey area. And in that process, we came with the message that Victoria started us out with very clearly. We want to see examples analyzed of where these things work. So in contrast a little bit to some of the presentations earlier, we're starting from a forensic point of view, from processes that have been identified by communities and community-based leaders as being successful. How did they get there? And so to do that, I read a lot about co-production. We talk a lot about co-production. It never happens, right? This process I am very proud of. It's not been me who has done it, but I think it's quite unique, at least in terms of methodology. The questions came out of our participants from the first round and were workshopped, but with honoraria paying for those workshoppings over multiple iterations. Then a team of like 9 people workshopped the questions for the interviews over about 9 months. Then we did interviews with 22 people selected through snowball sampling nationwide, representing 33 cases. Almost all of us were on many of the interviews. And then we've been going through it again collectively, triangulating over and over, and the results will be triaged and triangulated with the participants. It takes a lot of work, but I think it's kind of cool. So I encourage you to think about methods as well when you think about research. Just to queue up and give a little bit of a teaser to our findings. What works when people do things that go beyond their job description. No job descriptions do the things that are essential. No project descriptions and no plans mention the things that our participants highlighted as essential. So today we're going to say some of those things with the hope that you will carry them forward in your research and maybe also include them or understand them or foreground them or make them visible in the types of planning documents or funding calls or things that you do. We find that these are connected to different types of outcomes very immediately, but also perhaps more interestingly, they're based in, come from, and contribute and compound systems and relationships and relational networks that continue and maybe hold the promise of other good stuff happening in the same place. Continues. With that, I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
All right, so thank you, Bernadette. Before I introduce these, I want everyone in the room for a moment to just Remove your occupation and title from your sense of identity for just one moment. And bear with me. So we identified 5 roles that help shape fair and accountable resilience practices. Roles that hopefully can relate no matter what background someone comes from and how they enter the space of resilience planning. Today, we'll be diving into 2 of these roles with a little bit more detail, providing more context on when these roles benefit resilience initiatives, and acknowledging that not all 5 of these roles are necessary at once for equitable processes. So first, we have facilitators who connect people and resources, breaking down traditional silos of work and encouraging interdisciplinary action for holistic results. Next, we have educators who foster knowledge exchanges. Education in this sense has an emphasis on two-way sharing. So communities, practitioners, agency partners, and researchers alike are all learning within the context of the community itself. Other roles include mentors who help communities find their own power, such as providing support on a community-led project like Victoria described. Defenders who fight against past and present injustices, such as a community advocate who stands up against city policies. And lastly, we have mediators who help stakeholders talk to each other, resolving conflicts for productive conversations. Now looking more into facilitators whose work spans many boundaries. So whether that's understanding institutional processes to bring the right people to the table. Here we're going to focus on the facilitation of money and funding, which was a common challenge amongst our interviewees, and I suppose a lot of you can relate. Financing for community engagement, let alone to sustain community engagement, presents numerous challenges, one of which is described here by one of our interviewees who commented on how grants don't provide enough flexibility. With the funding process for projects often initiating before the project even begins, it's difficult for practitioners to pivot, or as our interviewee mentions, provide comparable resources for partners they may learn about later on. The long-term goal with facilitation is intricately tied to mentorship, one of our other roles, in that facilitators provide all the necessary resources for the community, an ongoing process, of course, as needs may change. Facilitators are, as one of our interviewees mentioned, partners until infinity, and they become self-sustaining communities that can implement resilience initiatives themselves. So here's an example that encapsulates successful facilitation, as well as aspects of education and mentorship. A lot of these are overlapping. One of our interviewees teams had a contract to facilitate the Silverleaf buyout program south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. For the program to move forward, all 41 households in the community had to agree to the contract terms. So to achieve this, their team interacted with each household individually, sitting down with them to gain their trust, which is especially important because of the discussion of personal finances here. They assisted with describing the program in alignment with their household needs, as well as helping fill out the paperwork. Through the interactions, though, the team realized that the buyout funds wasn't enough for the community and further advocated for the state to provide more funding, but not just as a blanket check, but as funding that will account for different financial situations. In actively seeking financial opportunities for the community, they successfully secured additional funding to align with local needs and gained the trust of community members in the meantime. As our interviewee said, we could have never done this through public meetings. We had to sit in their homes and build the trust to make the initiative successful. In their individualized approach, grounded in respect, this project team equipped the community with both the institutional and financial resources they needed, and also provided households with deeper understanding of them, which leads us to our second role of educators, as Amelia will now describe.
Yes, so we wanted to also highlight the role of educators. So just to refresh, educators are people who engage in and help ensure that there is multi-way knowledge sharing and not just in a formal top-down process. And what we talked to many different educators that had a variety of backgrounds, but we wanted to highlight a couple that really encapsulate like the importance of educators in these processes. And so one educator we spoke to is a community leader in historically Black community along the Eastern Seaboard. And they mentioned how in their role as an educator, what they found was most vital was their position in conveying oftentimes technical and confusing concepts in a way to community members who may not have as much background in these topics in a way that these community members could understand, and then also translating community needs to policymakers and academics in a way that they would best understand. And we can see here that by bridge building, by serving as bridge builders, these educators not only translate literally sometimes between different languages, but also technically and or metaphorically through translating different technical terms to more understandable languages. And this ensures that people are not just separated by power and are able to connect through their differences in culture and experience. And it really shows that there's a great need for context-specific actions to make these initiatives successful and to have a genuine understanding of community needs. And so another example of educators that we want to highlight is that we spoke to an agency partner in Florida, and they mentioned that their agency has these youth education programs that will teach young students about things like seaweed and why it's important for the local ecosystem. And there's oftentimes a mentorship aspect along with these programs. And we see here that not only do the young students benefit from this and the communities learn more about these vital topics. The agencies actually benefit from this as well because they're able to spread more information on what they're actually striving towards, what their goals are. And through doing this, they get a lot more community support. And we see how it's so important to know that educators don't just teach, they help to reshape systems by enabling all different types of parties to have the tools and capacity to actually listen and learn from one another because everyone has something really valuable to teach, and it's really important that we find the tools and capabilities to listen. So passing it back to
Seconds.
1 minute.
Okay. So what Hella said at the beginning, put your job description aside. Think about how these processes happen and think about who's doing what. Think about what Victoria said at the beginning, BQE green. That knowledge came from the community. That was technical, fancy planning from a community organization, right? One of our agency people, on the other hand, is doing hands-on educating with youth. Wait, isn't that supposed to be a community organization? The point is, these types of roles and these types of actions are needed and are what come through. It's nothing new to all of you who've worked in these spaces, right? It almost seems too basic to say, and yet people aren't saying it. So we, in our analysis, we found, along with some of the roles which we really just, did not great justice to by not getting into the depths of the stories, but hopefully a teaser, what are some of the conditions that underpin these types of fair and accountable places as measured and told by communities as successful spaces? Again, fairly kind of, I don't want to say obvious, but things that should be essentially human is foregrounding relationships. To do that takes time, takes respect. One of our interviewees said, please treat communities as the executive decision makers that they are. Shared interests and shared values. They're not easy. And so we look forward to being in conversation with you all about these, to hear about more cases, to hear pushback, if this makes sense or not, and how we can kind of be in conversation with you all as well as with our participants in making a useful communication of some of the complexities that you all are intimately familiar with. Here's a QR code to link to our previous paper and other white papers and reports and angry memos that me and all of the team have put together.
I'd like for all of the panelists to come to the front of the room. We just have space, and we do have 10 minutes, shockingly, for questions, if there are any. Maybe panelists have questions for one another. Imagine you, oh, we have a question from the audience. Please go ahead. I'll give you the mic.
Hi, my question is for the UPICS folks. So I'm Sydney Fishman. I'm with Washington Sea Grant, and I recently connected. I'm So if you're not familiar, Sea Grants kind of serve as a boundary spanning organization. We're placed at universities, but we work across all parts of the ocean and coastal space. So I'm closely connected with our state shoreline planning agency, and I've also recently gotten connected with several early career professors at the University of Washington, and I'd like to help them collaborate more. And so for the UPICS folks, do you have any advice on setting up these initial connections between a state agency like our State Department of Ecology and professors? What could I learn? Lessons learned? How do I start? How do I help them talk to each other? Any advice on that? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would say I can share kind of like how we started out the partnerships and doing that. It was a lot of on our end, kind of like knowing what programs or professors that would be best to be engaging with, and then just reaching out to them and then just be like, hey, we're interested in this topic or this type of project. Would this work within kind of like what you're working on? Was this match with your research? And then the way we set up our partnerships was really to kind of utilize a co-design model with like the professors and the programs based on like what they offer course-wise. And so it was a lot of like, these are the things that we really want to dive into, and then contacting the folks that we think would be like most relevant. And then in case they didn't have kind of like that model fit for communication, they generally are pretty open of like identifying other people to talk to and then like kind of start that communication. So it was really like a lot on our end of kind of doing the research of like what professors, what programs to talk to, and then kind of spreading from there based on kind of like our goals, but then also making sure that it aligns with their goals, their research, and also like their courses, and making sure the students also are like actually getting something out of it.
And just to add on, once we started establishing these relationships, we also have a document with guidelines to sort of talk about that first initial meeting with the professors. Like, for instance, what does the timeline look like? What does the timeline look like? What is our specific interest this year that we're looking for in terms of a call for proposals is also what we do. So sending that out just so that we can have an idea of what the professor is looking for and seeing where we align. And then we also usually require at least one office hour between the students, just so that we can also get some one-on-one time with the students to be able to learn more about them, and they can learn more about the state, and then also doing regular check-ins throughout the semester or quarter with the professors as well.
I'll also add to, we like to bring in other experts from the state, whether that's like within our own agency and office or connect with other agencies of like, if it's relevant to the topic too. And I think that has helped kind of spread that kind of communication and partnership across different programs, universities, and like across the different regions of the state too.
We have a question from one of the panelists.
Questions, but they're both short. First one is, how did Paysandu swing all that funding to pay for so many cool consultants and studies? That seems really neat. I'm so curious. The second is for Ryan vis-a-vis Delaware. I was really intrigued by your findings on the, and for the environmental justice areas, that 0.41, could you explain to us a little bit how to interpret it? Because is it a 41% more than others? You flew over it, so I would love to hear you go into a little bit more depth. Thanks.
Yeah, I can address that. Oh, sorry. No, you're first.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. Yes, it's super interesting because Paysandu is actually a border town that is located between Uruguay on the Uruguay border, but right adjacent to the Argentina border too. So that river, Paysandu, the Uruguay River actually is the borderline between two nations. So on strategically location, like from the political and the strategy like point of view, it has this like political worth of developing this master plan. And also the fee for the master plan, our effort definitely went over the budget. But this is more like the really interesting opportunity. And then we brought onto the competition with the of this master plan with the architect. The fee is low, but it's just a really interesting project that brings the design, engineering, and the local community together. Yes.
Yeah, so a few words about the EJI correlation. The 0.41 was just the correlation number, so correlation coefficient. So it indicates that in the unincorporated parts of Sussex County, areas with a higher EJI, that tend to have a higher EJI, also tend to have a higher resilience policy score. Most of what's behind that EJI number, especially the contrast to the SVI, so the EJI, the Environmental Justice Index, includes a handful of health components. So things like heart disease is a big one. Cancer diagnoses, I believe, are also a big one. Age is a big component, all of which kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that those areas have a very large retiree population. So I think it's more of a correlation than a causation. It's a very popular space in Delaware, well, nationwide, but especially in Delaware for retirees because it's relatively like low cost, nice coastal area. And I think that correlates with the EJI.
I have a question. I don't want to mess up your acronym. Is it RCCP for your crew? In the places where communities are saying it was good community engagement, not to oversimplify, often a barrier to that we see is government agencies are really afraid to hand over any kind of power or decisions. Do you have any comment on, like, was there a common thread and what got over that hurdle in those places where it did go well?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think, as Bernadette mentioned during the presentation, like there are kind of those like 5 key factors that when applied were effective, right? And so one of those is relationships. And one of the things we found was that when agencies took the time to build like respected relationships with the communities, it became easier on both ends for trust to be there and for them to be able to relinquish a little bit of that control and be like, okay, these communities know what they're talking about. They are leaders, they are experts, and we would be remiss not to listen to them. So I would say that was one of the big takeaways that I had from both elements of our research, but I don't know if you guys would add. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us, as Victoria said, through the end. Thank you especially to the many panelists who all stayed within the time frame. When is that ever happened? Made it through the tech glitches, and have a great Juneteenth. Thanks for your work.